Welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast, hosted by Dave Roberts. Humanity possesses a unique skill, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This podcast embraces that ability, offering learning opportunities through conversations with extraordinary guests. Dave aims to leave a positive mark on individuals around the world. So before you dive into today's episode, please share this podcast with your network, including friends, family, and colleagues. And please consider leaving a rating or review. Your support makes all the difference.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, and today it is my pleasure to have as my guest Brad Wetzler. Brad Wetzler is a writer, editor, memoir coach, and teacher who has spent his life chasing big stories, both out in the world and within himself. He began his career as an editor at Outside Magazine, working with some of America's finest nonfiction writers. As senior editor and later a longtime contributing editor, he helped shape narratives about adventure, endurance, and exploration. He served as editorial project manager for Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. Eventually, he left the editor's chair to become a writer himself, traveling the world to report on adventure, politics, business, the environment, and wellness for the New York Times, Newsweek, National Geographic, Wired, GQ, Travel and Leisure, Men's Journal, and other publications. In midlife, after years of chasing the next great story, he found himself on an unexpected journey inward. Recovering from a long battle with depression, he turned to yoga, meditation, and deep spiritual inquiry, seeking answers beyond the material world. Now a certified yoga teacher and memoir coach, Brad writes and teaches about personal transformation, faith, and the complex intersection of mind and spirit. His memoir, Into the Soul of the World, explores his search for healing from depression, PTSD, and addiction, and quest for meaning through travel, struggle, and self-discovery. He's currently at work on a new book about belief, doubt, and the long road to faith. Brad is also the founder and lead teacher of Writing the Soul, a personal development and guided journaling course designed to help people reconnect with their true selves through writing. Through his coaching and teaching, he helps writers turn raw experience into compelling narrative, guiding them to find the deeper wisdom in their own lives. He lives in Boulder, Colorado, where he hikes the mountain trails with his dog, Tommy, and helps others bring their stories to life. And Tommy may opt to join the podcast at some point. And Brad, if he does, it's more than welcome. And I'm sure he might have something to contribute.
He has some things to say. I know that. It's good to see you, Dave.
It's good to see you too, Brad. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time now. We met through a podcast guest forum. I found your story to be very provocative. I have identified with individuals who have transcended challenge through travel. And I think particularly during our pre-chat, we talked about Neil Peart, the late great drummer for Rush, who with his own tragedies found music and motion and travel to be healing for him. And when I read about your journey, it resonated so deeply with what has inspired me that I really felt compelled to have you on the podcast. So I'm glad we were able to do this today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for finding me. And I'm just really looking forward to this too. So happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you. So I guess we might as well get right down to it. So first question I have for you, Brad, is tell our audience about your book, Into the Soul of the World, and what do you want readers to learn from your experiences?
Well, Into the Soul of the World tells the story of my journey to become an adventure writer and the single-pointed desire and ambition I had to do that, only to find myself several years in struggling with the life of an adventure writer, struggling with a lot of internal conflict and depression, and eventually a descent into deep depression and an extreme over-medication with psychiatric drugs. And then after the death of a close friend, a suicide of a close friend, I began to make some early decisions to try to turn my life around and heal. And and ended up going on a 10-year spiritual journey that surprised me for somebody who had been kind of a just the facts ma'am journalist for a long time. And this spiritual journey led me back to therapy and doing some deep therapeutic work, but it also took me back into the world of travel and some maybe unconventional methods of healing to finally face that I had been misdiagnosed as a young man with a mental health disorder that turned out to be wrong, and I got a new one that fit finally and allowed me the chance to heal. And so it's a story of it's a classic redemption story in a way. It's also a story about following intuition and following any road that seems to make sense towards healing and sort of that single-minded desire to finally feel more healed and whole.
Yeah, and I remember, I think one of the quotes from a favorite author of yours is "The road leads someplace." And I remember you saying that is that the road leads someplace. And if we just take that road, we're going to come out on the other side and we're going to find what we need to become whole.
Yes, and that quote came from actually an explorer that I had interviewed way back in 1999. This guy was older at this point. He was in his late 70s. He'd spent his life exploring in South America, and he had found himself lost in the jungle at one point. He was in his tent reading maps, and his someone hit a stone, and he heard the ringing out loud, and he ran out to try to uncover that stone and figure out, because he knew that they had found a road, an old Incan road. I was even confused at that time. I said, "Well, how does that save you?" He just looked at me and said, "Brad, a road goes someplace." I knew we were saved, that we would either end up in civilization or at another ruin, or we'd find our way out. And I didn't even really understand that quote at the time, but it made a lot more sense later. And sometimes that road is a method. Sometimes maybe it's a particular path, a religion, or a particular therapist. And sometimes it's our own intuition and simply our own desire to heal. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that also kind of aligns with the Neil Peart quote in one of his book, Ghostwriter, Heal or Travels on the Healing Road, which is keep moving, something will come up.
Yeah.
And
I
it's like,
love that.
yeah, me too. And that gave me a lot of inspiration for my own tragedies in my life. So
Yeah.
I want to go back to May 1978 because I know this is where this all began
Hmm.
for you in the Arkansas White, White River. Tell us about that event and how did that impact the course of your life as an adult?
Yeah. I was 12 years old, and I was on a weekend canoeing trip on the White River in Arkansas. It was a father-son canoeing trip with a group that I belonged to. And after lunch, my dad and I set the canoe into the water. We pushed out into the current, and the water was very high this weekend. In fact, we'd been told it might be better not to run it. It had been a heavy spring rains, and the fathers decided, no, we're going to do this. We've traveled too far not to. Well, none of the fathers knew how to canoe. This was one of those kinds of trips, and we were in way over our head. Well, water came over the side of the canoe. We tipped over, and I found myself floating down the river. And then in a sudden tug, I just felt myself jerked back, and I felt the whole pressure of this river against my back. And then I was pulled under, and then I was let back up, and then pulled under again. And finally, it just sort of settled, and I realized that my life jacket had snagged on a submerged log. And I could see in the distance my dad was drifting towards the bank, and I was just stuck there for I still don't know how, it was at least 10 minutes. Eventually, another canoe rammed into me and let me loose, and I drifted down. I was placed in the bottom of another boat, and my father came over and got me. And well, so that was the actual event, which was very traumatizing to a 12-year-old. I must have weighed, I don't know, 80 pounds, whatever I weighed at that time, not very much. And then when I got home, I went to tell my mother, and I'd had cuts and bruises all over my side. And my father stepped in front of me and just told her that I that it didn't happen. And so I went, remember going to bed and spending the next week kind of nursing these cuts and bruises and trying to make sense of that. I'm trying to make sense of not only the accident itself, but this deep betrayal, that I didn't even understand at that time. So that event would later color my entire life, as you said.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about growing up in a dysfunctional family,
Mm.
about the unhealthy dynamics that were going on between your dad, your brother, you, your mom. How did that contribute to the challenges you experienced in your adult life? And also, early experience matters. And at
Yeah,
age 12, I was reading that. I was thinking that's a hell of an introduction to puberty, to
yeah,
be basically left on your own, to be
yeah.
fighting for your life without anybody even showing any modicum of initiative to try to save you. So talk about that a little bit in terms of
Yeah,
those challenges that you had growing up in your family and how that contributed to the challenges you experienced.
yeah. Well, so I spent most of after that accident. I think it really opened up my perceptions for one thing, because I began to notice a lot more about my family. And my dad was drinking heavily every night to the point that he had to be walked to bed, and my mother was ignoring the situation. And I just found myself, apart from just that unhealthy dynamic, there was just a lot of lying and deceit going on in the family. And I remember being a truth teller at a young age and being at dinner and just asking, could we talk about what's going on? And just the entire family staring at me, can we look, see dad is drunk here. Can we talk about what happened? Whatever. I was that kid who was just constantly calling things out, but also just wanting a conversation about it. And well, I think over time, and you know this well, Dave, as a therapist, and this is stuff I've learned over the years. Well, kids need two things. They need attachment and nourishment and love, that part of things, but they also need authenticity. They need to be themselves. And, I think when when there are lies going on, when there's denial going on, a kid will twist his brain around so that they get love. But over time, that doesn't really work, and they'll twist their own brains into knots and be confused about who they are, what's real. My own brain was just very, I'll just say, twisted. And then among other things, though, Dave, that you know I also functioned in my family as sort of a scapegoat figure. I mean, I was that kid who had a lot of openness, a lot of empathy, and my family was very perfectionistic. And I became kind of the dumping grounds for at least what I now experienced as sort of their unwanted parts of themselves. And I carried a lot of shame, in a perfectionistic family. It will take on all that shame. And of course, over time, that kid will be angry and act out, and they'll get punished for that. So it's just kind of this cycle of being othered. There's a passage in the Bible, I think it's Leviticus, about the scapegoat. And, the scapegoat is in ancient times in the Jewish tradition was the tribe would have a ceremony and pick the strongest goat out and load all their sins onto it in a ceremony, and literally send it out into the desert to die. And that might sound dramatic to your listeners, but that is essentially what happens with these kinds of kids is they get othered until they don't belong to themselves anymore. They don't belong to the family. To this day, I'm still outside of the family unit and really had to spend years trying to understand what had happened to me. So,
Yeah, and particularly we get a lot of mixed messages. We know what we're seeing is real, but we're told that it isn't real. So it's like you
yeah.
you try to, because we're conditioned to want to honor our parents. We're conditioned to try to look good in their eyes. So we're
Mhm.
thinking, well, geez, maybe what I'm seeing isn't real. So let me twist my perception to fit their
Yeah.
reality, which is skewed to begin with.
Mhm.
And you talked about projection, and Freud, of a lot of his work that he did was, for all intents and purposes today would probably be considered to be way out there, but his work on defense mechanisms was brilliant. And he
Yeah.
talked about projection. And with projection, we project those parts of ourselves so we don't want to see in ourselves.
Mhm.
And we project those onto others. And that's where in families that are unhealthy, there's always a scapegoat. And you looking at it, you were a convenient scapegoat, not
Yeah.
only for your father, but for your brother
Yes,
as well
exactly.
too. So you were getting it from both ends. You were getting it from the sibling end, you were getting it from your father's end, and you were also simultaneously a caregiver for your mother and your father.
Yeah.
Well, there was a lot that you had to shoulder at a young age,
Yeah.
and you got no any type of validation for it. And anytime you attempted to talk about something, you were told that, well, it's no really big deal. That it was minimized, and you were kind of, like you said, othered out.
My father and I have been trying to piece back some kind of connection lately, and I'll just share this, that I went to visit him after years of being estranged, and we sat in a conference room and tried to have a conversation, and it didn't go horribly. You talk about being othered, and this is all unconscious, as you know, or a lot of it is. I mean, it's just no one knows why they're doing what they're doing to you, and yeah, so it's crazy.
Yeah, because particularly when families or individuals operate with defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
they're unconscious, they're habitual, and individuals will just do this automatically without even thinking. And when individuals become alarmed with their defense mechanisms, when they have a desire to want to work on those mechanisms,
Yeah.
you're made aware of the behaviors that contributed to that, and then there's a whole level of anxiety that gets triggered because you're bringing into conscious awareness something that they had suppressed.
Yeah.
So,
Well, there's a line in my book. I know you read, which you read at some point. A therapist, told me that at least you got out of your family with your soul, and I remember just weeping at hearing that, because I think there's some truth in that.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
and I know we were talking before we began to record that. I think one of the more profound therapeutic moments that I've ever read about was when it was, I think Susan, I think she was your therapist in Boulder, Colorado, and where she told you that you are not the child of your specific parents any longer. You are a child of the world, a child of this universe, a child of God. I got emotional, and I'm getting emotional reading that, because that was, for anybody that's ever been othered by their family or seen as less than. That quote to me said, we're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
Or we're part of something greater, and that the universe, in comparison to where we were born into, is just so infinitesimally large. And we are a child of the wise ones, the great thinkers, the universe, everything that comprises the universal whole and the universal energy of the earth. And I thought that was just so profound. And if that were me, I would have found that to be incredibly healing.
I remember putting my head in my hands and weeping at that moment of the truth of that. And I think clearly she had probably listened to a lot of hours of me talking about the suffering and pain I had had with my family. And I don't remember the exact circumstances, but I must have just shown a glimpse that I was starting to see something beyond that experience. And it just moved me to tears. And I do believe that. And I've got this altar here full of the wise ones you mentioned, and I just am reminded. I sit in front of that every morning and am reminded that we're all children of God and children of beyond the circumstances that we particularly grew up in. So thank you for bringing that up.
In your book, you quote Freud, and I always tell my students, I said, when I'm teaching any type of a course that's about human behavior, we're not going to get away without talking about Freud. So we're not going to get out of this podcast without mentioning Freud. You quoted Freud as follows, that we will consciously gravitate towards the things that wound us. You then go on to say that I put myself in situations that would traumatize me in an unconscious attempt to heal. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. I mean, you obviously know a lot more about Freud than I do, but I do know that his idea of repetition compulsion is really what he's talking about there, and how when we're wounded by something, we can spend a lifetime putting ourselves back in that same circumstance, trying to heal it, trying to have a different outcome. And that's such a major theme in my life. I think I became an adventure writer for that very reason. Nature had wounded me deeply, and I threw myself into all these absurd situations of being in roadless areas, being outside of any way to get rescued if I needed it, and all over the world, in deserts, mountains, glaciers, open sea, all these places. And in retrospect, I was trying to heal that nature wound, but it also goes beyond that. I've always been drawn to rivers too, which is interesting. I walk rivers constantly in my hometown and other places I visit. But it's also true in relationships too. I think I have found myself being drawn to the similar types of people that I grew up with, and trying to solve these relational issues I had with people who had the same problems that my family had. So it's a theme that runs through my life, and that I'm bringing more awareness to it these days, I think, and making better decisions. But when it's in your unconscious, you just don't have much of a choice until you bring it to consciousness.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a relevant point. This reminds me of what John Bradshaw, who's written a lot of work on unhealthy families, and he's talked about codependency. One of the things he said is that hockey players don't play with chess players.
Yeah.
And individuals are going to align with other individuals who are very familiar with the rules of growing up in a family.
Yeah.
If it's a healthy family, they're going to align with individuals who have similar rules. If they grow up in an unhealthy family, they're going to align with individuals that understand those rules because one, it's familiar, and secondly, it's a way that they can continue to work through their traumas by putting themselves in that situations. And I talked to other individuals, Brad, who grew up in such unhealthy circumstances that they wanted to go to somebody else's house to just do a comparison check to see if everybody lived like they did, and they wanted to see what a quote unquote healthy family looked like.
Well, and sometimes a healthy person can feel strange or not safe. That's sort of this kind of inverse world we can live in, where we're drawn and we feel more comfortable with the type of people that are going to wound us again.
Yep. And when we get into a relationship, and I've had clients tell me this, that when they've gotten into a relationship where there was unconditional love, where their past indiscretions did not matter to their current partner, they would question whether they were worthy of that unconditional love because of the circumstances they grew up in, and would consciously sabotage the relationship because they just didn't feel worthy enough to experience any type of love or experience any type of joy.
Which also, this as well, but from when you finally find a therapist that gets you and shows you that unconditional love and becomes that relationship where you're accepted no matter how much anger you show or whatever, that is an incredibly healing experience and can set you up finally for breaking that habit, I think. So,
yeah, and I think the way we hold space for a client, that can be a spiritual experience in and of itself, because we're communicating that there's going to be unconditional acceptance, that the client has the right to self-determine, that I am here to collaborate with you so that we can work on a plan that's going to help you achieve your goals and be on the path to healing. That in and of itself can be a very profound spiritual experience and create that sense of connection that is so important in any relationship.
I've been really graced to have some really good therapists in this latter phase of my life, where actually earlier on I didn't so much. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember reading about your first interaction with the psychiatric community.
Yeah.
And the first impression, Brad, that I had was with your initial contact, that he was looking for a reason to diagnose you with bipolar disorder.
Yep.
He was asking questions that were kind of leading questions, and that would lead you into an answer that would justify a diagnosis, when the way diagnosis should be done is that we do a comprehensive history, and before we make a diagnosis, we rule out any possible physical conditions that could account for the behavior that we're seeing, or we take a look at family dynamics, social, cultural dynamics, and then we make the decision. But it looked like he was, again, I mean, to me, just trying to, he had you already diagnosed before you walked in the door. Unfortunately, that carried with you, I think, for a couple of psychiatrists. And you talked about diagnostic momentum.
Yes.
Where they would just, when this psychiatrist who initially diagnosed you retired, he referred you to another psychiatrist who, rather than reevaluate your circumstances, just continued it on the same regimen of meds with the same diagnosis without any reevaluation. And to me, that is not a way that I would do treatment. That's not even ethical. And it's not even consistent with good practice guidelines, regardless of the profession you're talking about.
Well, and it played into my personality at the time too, because I was such a people pleaser. I also found that answer. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at age 24, and it let my family off the hook. It let me off the hook. It was a brain disorder, right? So nothing had caused it except a glitch in my brain, and it just turned out not to be true for me. And at the time, I just embraced it. I took those medications so almost gleefully in a sick way, like it was just, this was the answer, and I was going to be better and okay now because of that. And it led me into more drugs, the doctors, because I didn't have bipolar. None of the drugs did anything to help me. And so I found myself 10 years in taking 13 different medications, 23 pills a day, still taking lithium, and I was still traveling around the world. And eventually I was in Indonesia and got very dehydrated and got lithium poisoning, because dehydration can cause that to happen. And I lost 50% of my kidney capacity to this day. So, paid a heavy price for that misdiagnosis that happened in one session.
Yeah. You're misdiagnosed when the medications aren't working.
Yeah.
And bipolar.
Well, I was going to say, and I knew, the other interesting fold to this was I grew up in the professional classes. My family, I had lawyers everywhere in my family, a lot of respect for lawyers and doctors. And, there was something, just talk about unconsciously, I believed this man in a white coat more than I believed myself. And I knew I was going in. This is such a strange thing, even to admit right here. I knew that I wasn't having mood swings, that I was really having relational stuff, and I was having, some dark depressions, but I just never felt bipolar 1 or 2. And I would go in there and he would ask me how I've been, and maybe I've been feeling too good. He'd write it down. I'm feeling manic or whatever. It was just a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I said, being a people pleaser, having been victimized, it's really difficult to find your own voice in that situation. And you
Right.
just let life happen as opposed to making it happen, or opposed to just speaking up and challenging in a
Right.
respectful way what you're being told.
Yes. So eventually I did move away from the psychiatrist that had medicated me so heavily and found a new one. And at that point, I was convinced I wasn't bipolar anymore. And he said, let's get you off as many. He started to become convinced of it too. Let's get you off as many of these drugs as we can and see who you really are. And I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd been not only grown up in a dysfunctional family, but had spent, 15 years plus on all these medications. And it really was an unraveling of these drugs and an emerging of a new self. And it was not an easy process, and it's still going on.
Yeah, and I remember, I remember the moment that you were told by your psychiatrist that you had been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, and then in fact you had experienced PTSD and complex PTSD. I found this to be a particularly powerful moment in the book. So would you tell our audience about how that unfolded and what was going through your mind as far as thoughts and feelings when you were told that, hey, we got it wrong?
Yeah, I remember that well. And remember sitting in his office. We'd been working. My other psychiatrist in Boulder had retired. And so I was with somebody new for a year. And I know today, there's many memoirs about trauma, and there's lots of discussion around trauma. This was before really that. And so he said, it's time for us to discuss diagnoses. And like my whole body clenched. I'd been, as we know, misdiagnosed, and I was just terrified about what was going to come up. And he looked at me and he just said, Brad, you have PTSD. You never had bipolar. And obviously I'm getting choked up here. It was such a gift, It was someone who finally saw me clearly, someone who had stayed with me through some times. I mean, obviously with PTSD, there's anger issues can come up, and he stayed with me. And I was just so moved that I put my hands over my head and over my eyes and cried and cried. And then he said, you don't need to hide your face. There was no shame in it. And it was just such a life-changing moment for me, because it gave me finally the option to try to heal. And that's what I went for it then. So.
And what also impressed me is that he apologized on behalf of the whole psychiatric profession for how they had misdiagnosed you and treated you.
Yeah, that was huge. We don't often get the apologies that we need and deserve, and that was a big one. And it was fascinating to me, because This is a psychiatrist that is very old school. This is not a new breed of functional psychiatrist. This is a guy who is by the book, who's almost militaristic in a way. And it was quite a funny matchup between us. And this man, I think he saved my life in a way. And hearing that apology just, again, was so meaningful.
And I when I was reading about that, I was also thinking, boy, the universe put those individuals in your path, particularly in the second part of your journey, that were going to
Yeah.
get you on the road to healing and realize that you had worth, you have worth. We screwed up,
Yeah.
and we want to help you fix this and make this better. So I thought that to have that kind of accountability in the medical profession or any profession, to me, was huge. And one of the things I impress upon my students is be accountable. When you make a mistake, you misdiagnose, own it. It's going to make you more human in the eyes of that individual that you're working with. And that's going to further your ability to build a therapeutic and long-lasting relationship with that individual. Your ability to be vulnerable and say, hey, I messed up. I was wrong.
Yeah.
Let's see what we can do together to fix this.
Yeah, I know we're going to get to the spiritual aspects of this soon, but this was the same doctor who, after I had traveled to India and had this quite an experience that we'll talk about, and basically a 12-hour mystical experience, had said, Brad, you deserved that. I know that was real. And like, man, that was a whole other set of tears.
Well, yeah, particularly, hearing that your perceptions growing up weren't real, that they were skewed, they were wrong. You're minimizing, you're over dramatizing. And to have somebody say, hey, I'm glad you experienced that. I know it to be real. And that's what we need to do when we sit with other people's stories. We don't judge the experience. We don't say, well, this experience didn't happen, because we can't consensually validate that.
Right.
But what we can find out is, what was the impact that experience had on you? How did it help you find peace? How did it help you get through a challenge? That's what, if we could all do that as therapists, as coaches, as, companions,
Yes,
the world would be a better place.
it really would. And, because then eventually it allows us to, those of us who grew up in these warped, dysfunctional situations, to learn to trust those experiences themselves too. You need to sort of go through that, being mirrored by people who care about you, to eventually learn to trust these experiences yourself. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think you also mentioned in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you had to learn to trust yourself, you had to learn to trust others, and you had to learn to trust in something greater than yourself.
Yes. As my journey continued, I ended up traveling across Israel and Palestine. I walked in Jesus' footsteps, trying to understand my own childhood obsession with Jesus. It was kind of funny. I was sort of seeking out in the physical world the internal aspects of compassion and mercy that Jesus had. And I was still searching out there for what was in here. And then when I came back from those trips, that's when I really went inside and really began my own spiritual seeking, really went down the rabbit hole with yoga, not just the postures, but the philosophies behind it, and Buddhism, and studied those traditions. One of the things I found was this idea of a bigger idea of self, this idea of the child of God. We live in a world of diagnoses, of pulling apart, of definitions. Science has given us so much, but the cost of it has been great too, in that the idea of putting together and synthesizing and imagining yourself as whole and as a child of God, or connecting with a God, is very healing to be moving out of those. I was really a self-diagnoser, as much as I allowed myself to be diagnosed. And when I began on a spiritual path, I began to see the wholeness of things, the wholeness of myself, the wholeness of others, the wholeness of the world that is, even in its brokenness, can have this wholeness to it. So it was life-changing, and it was such an important part of my healing path. And I do, without, beating any particular methods or books or anything, I just think that anyone who's on a healing journey from PTSD or anything like this, that if you can find a spiritual path and some way of imagining yourself and the universe apart from what's given to us and in our culture, it really can be life-changing. So,
And speaking of life-changing, Tell our audience about the life-changing experience that you had with Babaji,
Mm,
the Himalayan foothills of India.
yeah. So in 2018, first of all, I traveled to India in 1999, and I'd been there on assignment for Wired magazine, and I had written about the tech industry in India at the time. And I remember hurrying to get that work done because I wanted to go to Varanasi. I'd had friends that had been to Varanasi, and I was practicing yoga then, but I wasn't very far on a spiritual path. And while in Varanasi, it's famous as being a place where people go to die, and they have these large steps and platforms where they burn bodies 24 hours a day. And so anyway, I'd been to India in 1999, experienced that. And I'd always wanted to go back. And in 2018, was finally ready to go back. And I was on this healing journey now. And I was studying this form of yoga called Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga of love and devotion. And well, I got to India, and this friend of mine told me that he'd heard there was a 100-year-old yogi that lived in a cave on a nearby mountaintop. Incidentally, we were also in the valley where Ram Dass had been with his guru in the 1960s and early 70s. And so these friends and I hiked up this mountain, and we got to the top of the mountain and took our shoes off, and we entered the cave one by one. I entered last, and as I bowed at his feet, which is what we've realized we were supposed to do. I remember touching his feet and just like saying, "This is crazy." I mean, I was on a spiritual path, but I was also this grumpy old journalist. I couldn't believe where I was. And as I started to sit up, I just felt this man strike the top of my head firmly with his hand. And then we made eye contact. And this man had been in this cave for 25 plus years, meditating and chanting. And I just lost it. I just began to weep, and I couldn't stop weeping. And I wept all afternoon as we sat in his cave, and we asked him questions through a translator. Um, and then at the end of the day, went back home, back to this ashram we were staying, and I went to bed. And the next morning, I got up early before dawn, and I fell into this trance, and as I tried to stand up, I started to stumble, and then I walked down this path, and everything started to feel surreal. And the snake crawled in front of my path, and the earth was vibrating behind it. The sky was vibrating. The mountains were vibrating. And I went down to where my girlfriend at the time was staying in the cabin, and I said, "I think I'm getting sick." My first reaction, I went to my DOP kit and looked for some medication to take. This was something I didn't understand. And I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And I remember saying, "I think someone slipped me LSD or something or mushrooms." That wasn't the case. And finally I walked back up to where I had been sitting and climbed on top of this building. And I spent 12 hours in this ecstatic state of bliss and tears and no connection to any of the suffering that I had experienced throughout my life. And then when the sun started to go down, I climbed back down, and I began to come back down. And then I was just the man I knew myself to be, but I had been changed. And I'm still to this day blown away by that experience, still wondering how I can put it to use in my own life, but maybe also give back with it. It was just a paradigm shattering moment in my life.
Yeah, and I think the spiritual quest is ongoing. And I know your
Yeah.
experience with Babaji, gee, that just really set it in motion. But when you walked the Jesus Trail, I think that was the beginning. For me,
Yes.
I saw that as the beginning of that quest, and then it culminated with Babaji in India. I would suspect that the transformation and the journey and the evolution is still ongoing at this point. It should be.
Yeah. It is, and I'm a person who, we talked about my journalism years. I mean, I do have a lot of doubt. I'm not someone who easily embraces a spiritual idea and just says it's true. And I'm constantly reevaluating. And so that's leading me to this next book I'm working on. The working title is The God I Can't Believe In. And sort of it's my journey back to God through a lot of years of not understanding and also
Mhm.
embracing doubt as the other side of faith. And it's something we've got to hold. It's the both and, I think there's danger, and at least for me, and just accepting doctrine wholeheartedly. So, yeah. Obviously,
and
because of, look what accepting psychiatry wholeheartedly did to me.
yeah, it didn't really do you any favors and really didn't help you in the long term. I've always told my students you'll run into situations where individuals are misdiagnosed. They'll feel obligated to stay with that doctor because they think the doctor knows more than them. In reality, they know themselves better than any doctor does.
Yeah.
And they need to trust their gut and intuition and say, this isn't working. I want to get a second opinion. I think everybody should be encouraged to, because every doctor looks at a patient differently or at a
Yeah.
client differently.
Well, I also came of age. I'm 50. I just turned 59 this week. And I came of age at a time when Prozac was brand new and these pills that, we're still stuck in this paradigm. But at that point, it just seemed like pills were the answer to psychiatric problems or, quote, psychiatric problems. And to only find out later that the pills actually prevented me from feeling things. And so prevented me from processing the trauma that I needed to process. It actually was a detriment to my healing, which is a heavy thing to think about too.
Well, and the other thing with bipolar disorder, there's a really difficult diagnosis to make because there's so many things that can mask it. Alcohol and other drug use can mask or intensify the systems. In a lot of cases, I think it's like 40% of individuals who are diagnosed with unipolar depression actually had bipolar disorder. And I've heard this from a psychiatric nurse practitioner who said the way you know that was misdiagnosed is if you give an individual who you diagnose as with unipolar depression an SSRI or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor like Prozac or Zoloft, person becomes more manic. But like I said earlier in the program, he was just looking for any kind of reason to fit you to a preconceived diagnosis. And then from there, it just kind of went on a downward spiral for you because you were misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
And that is one of the tragedies of misdiagnosis in terms of what not only happened to you, but happened to other individuals who were misdiagnosed. So is there anything else you want to address in terms of the role that spirituality has played in your recovery? And my second part of the question would be, what would you recommend or how would you advise or what would you suggest individuals who want to make spirituality a part of their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the central ideas of spirituality, and for me, compassion and mercy and all these things, and then they can all be directed at oneself. And I think that ultimately became one of the more healing things. I began practicing metta meditation, which is a Buddhist meditation in which you offer loving kindness or friendliness to yourself, to others, to enemies, to the entire universe of beings. And I began practicing that daily, 2 times a day for 20 minutes. And there's just a softening that began to happen with me over the years. When I was young, I was sarcastic and biting and all of these things that a good magazine writer needed to be. And I just found those parts of me, those almost like coats of leather over my own heart, just began to dissolve and to soften into, this. I don't know. I mean, I'm still pondering the idea of masculinity, which is what's coming up for me right now, because we have such warped ideas of masculinity right now. But I began to soften and I began to emerge. The man I am and have always maybe began to emerge with these practices. So I just encourage your listeners to explore, to find, most of the major traditions. I know that we live in a time with polarity and in our country, Christianity has become very doctrinized, but there are softer, more esoteric versions of almost every path out there that are really more closer to the true paths. And I just invite you to explore and find this sense of mercy and compassion for yourself. And I think that's where a lot of the healing can happen. And to me, it seems necessary as a part of a healing program. I don't know, maybe it's not for everybody, but I just think that if you can't be compassionate for yourself, you can't be a healthy person I knew I had just a lot of negative self-talk. That's where a lot of this work healed, and began to talk kinder to myself. At the end of the book, I say, I'm not sure exactly what has all changed in me, but I do talk more kindly to myself, and maybe that's everything.
Yeah, just showing yourself grace, showing yourself mercy, and realizing that given the hand of cards you were dealt, you did the best that you could under the circumstances.
Yeah.
And certainly your journey, your path is a testament to resilience, the celebration of the human spirit, and just working through some very adverse circumstances. I know one of the things that you've embarked on is you're a memoir coach, and I know that's something that is very important. Did that come out of your desire to want to be of service and help others as a result of your challenges, or was it something in addition to that or separate from that?
It was related. I think the desire to write a memoir came from this desire to finally tell my story and to reshape my story. I had such a warped idea of who I was, such a negative view of who I was, and finding the narrative line of your story and telling my healing journey, owned my story, and in dysfunctional family, I mean, your story is forced upon you, and finally reclaiming and owning this story became so important. And then I wanted to give that back to people. I wanted to help people to reclaim their own stories. So that became a big impetus for doing that work. In addition to coaching memoir, I'm launching a new program. It's called Writing the Soul, and it's seeking more spiritual and deep connection with your true self through not just memoir writing. You don't want to write a memoir to do this. It's sort of a guided journaling class in which we explore just our inner landscape through writing.
Do you also teach individuals? Is that an intuitive process as well too? Do you have them kind of just write whatever comes to mind or whatever is moving them at that particular moment?
I do that. And in my memoir coaching, in addition to just trying to help people be with their own stories, I do know a lot about the craft of writing. So I try to combine some of that to help them write the most powerful version of their story. Yeah, I work very intuitively. There are a lot of coaches out there that impose a program on them. I know everybody's different. Some of people need to have a structure first and then write. Some people just need to write. Some people need their hands held a little bit more. And so it's just been a lovely, meaningful way to make impact on people. So,
Yeah, and that's certainly a wonderful way to give back is helping people
yeah.
take ownership of their own stories, reshape their narratives, and be able to tell that to the world. So, Brad, if you were going to leave our listeners with one takeaway today, what would that be?
I was thinking about this. I think it's that healing is possible, and I think that sometimes we have to look in places other than the dominant modalities. We live in a medicalized psychiatric kind of a way of treating mental health these days. And I found healing in everything from travel to yoga to meditation to my dog, simple morning walks in the sunlight. I mean, I just began to see the entire universe as a healing modality and embraced it. So I just encourage you to follow your own intuition. Obviously, there are people that know things. Clearly, I'm sure you're a wonderful therapist for people. So I'm not telling people to not turn toward the usual resources, but to embrace everything they can find that feels like it can bring them healing.
Yeah, and particularly not to depend on just one individual for
Yeah.
that. Avail yourself of a variety of different spiritual teachers, different mentors, because each one of those individuals will give you something that the other can't. And together, they're kind of your community of souls on earth.
Yes.
And I think that allows us spiritually to feel connected to something outside of ourselves when we
Exactly.
avail ourselves of many masters.
Yep. I think one of the big healing things for me too, I had lost the ability to build community, and I think that was ended up being one of the more healing things too, was learning and relearning to have really good friendships. For me, finding friendships with men in particular was healing because of what I'd grown up with and the toxic
Mhm.
masculinity of my family. And so, yeah, all of this is the message I'd like to give.
And finally, my last question for you, Brad, is if people want to get in touch with you, purchase your book, find out more about your services. What's the best way for them to do that?
So the best way is to go to my website. It's bradwetzler.com, bradwetzler.com. And you can find out about my book and my courses and my coaching there. And also you can order my book from your local bookstore, and it's on Amazon. I would love for you to check out my book because there's a little bit of for everybody in this book, I think. So thank you for holding that up. Into the Soul of the World, My Journey to Healing.
Yeah, and I can attest, I read it cover to cover. I think there is probably more yellow than black and white in your book because I highlighted so much that just resonated with me. I would highly recommend it for anybody who is looking to, for a more spiritual path to transcend
Yeah.
tragedy, to transcend dysfunctional family dynamics. Brad's book is the way to go. There's just so much richness and so much vulnerability that you share. You left nothing
Mm.
out on the table. Everything about you is out there in unadulterated form.
That's true. I went to the bone. I know that. And I needed to. And it was a very healing process for me. I tried to write with compassion, though, too, for the other people in the story. But I also was finally ready to tell the story. So thank you for reading it. And thank you for having me on today.
Oh, Brad, you're welcome. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast. I enjoyed our conversation immensely, and I hope we can do a follow-up sometime in the future.
I'd love that, Dave. Yeah.
Thank you, Brad,
Thank you.
and my pleasure. And with that, that's a wrap on another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, wishing you peace.